The Decadent in love with his psychopomp, Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, and Adrian Lyne's Lolita. Decadent Physiognomy and the Child-Psychopomp. A quote by Thomas Mann. And does form not have two faces? Is it not moral and amoral at the same time? Unquote. Quote, passion as confusion and degradation was actually the subject matter of my story. Unquote. In contrast to Humbert, Aschenbach has never been familiar with his fervors, and once confronted with them, he powerlessly degrades himself. In this image, Visconti's androgynous Tajou, quote, as Hermes Psychopompos, unquote, is positioned as a threshold figure. He maintains intense eye contact with the, quote, impassioned onlooker, unquote, Aschenbach, who is standing in the lift with the illusion of an option. Venice, the, quote, sunken queen of cities, unquote, with a, quote, forbidden homosexual underworld, unquote, is the perfect setting for a decadent. Seen from the outside, the facades are picturesque, but behind and underneath them, everything is rotted, morbid, and brittle. The Venetian atmosphere is life-threatening and seductive. Whilst the, quote, capacity of a decadent's body, unquote, is deteriorating, the, quote, inclination of his soul, unquote, is at its highest. There are three types of perceptible decadence in the novella. The one of Tajou and Venice, Aschenbach's, and finally the decadent appearances of the Charon and Thanatos characters. Firstly, there is one decadent who foreshadows Aschenbach's decline and who is an inherent part of the, quote, aging traveler's, unquote, proper decadence and fate, the false youngling. Similar to Humbert's unwanted doppelganger Quilty, who is an obscure background character but still very influential, quote, the old fop, unquote, appears rather in the beginning, but leaves a disgusted and repulsed impact on Aschenbach, who attempts to disassociate himself from the merry-making, quote, goatbeard, unquote, who embodies everything he initially rejects. The false youngling, dressed in a bright yellow costume and articulating, quote, screeching gaiety, unquote, provokes in the, quote, lonely, wakeful watcher, unquote, a, quote, horror that this youth was not genuine, unquote. The unsuccessful masquerade of the wrinkled grotesque merrymaker is described as follows, that the, quote, faint carmine of his cheeks was rouge, the brown hair beneath the colorfully banded head was a wig, his neck was shrunken and sinewy, his clipped moustache and goatee were dyed. The full yellowish set of teeth he exposed when he laughed was a cheap set of dentures, and his hands, bedecked with signet rings on both forefingers, were those of an old man, unquote. Before Aschenbach's own degrading transformation into an artificial and unbelievable perversion of his former self, his overpowered decline is physically noticeable. His severe and pertinacious aura gradually dissolves into an often reoccurring physical flagging and weakening, his, quote, hands folded in his lap, unquote, and his, quote, arms hanging at his sides, unquote. The, quote, foreign traveler, unquote, suddenly realizes that he can be strangely moved, tired but nonetheless mentally stimulated. This conflicted state of the solitary guest always entails an emotional paradox that consists of a numbing lust and being full of sober passion. He contextualizes and theorizes his lust and passion instead of actively extroverting them, which burdens them with invalidity. The self-imposed prohibition and restraint exhaust him to such an extent that he suffers from a, quote, feverish listlessness, unquote, a, quote, throbbing of his temples, unquote, and a, quote, heaviness in his eyelids, unquote. The mere sight of Tajou and the epidemic Venetian atmosphere arouse in the arise in the aging artist, a nervousness and debility that render him, quote, intoxicated in head and heart, unquote. In Aschenbach's desperate delusion, he subjects himself to an aesthetic makeover that unmistakably links him to the tragic ridiculousness of the false youngling. He craves to please Tajou, whether this takes place in reality or in his daydreams. The quote, grey-haired traveler, unquote, with the quote, severe tired face, unquote, and an alarming quote, taste of gall in his mouth and of fantastic horror in his heart, unquote, seeks his last hope of attention and recognition within the means of masquerade. The quote, lonely author's unquote, masquerade does not match his age. It might even distortedly highlight it even more. In contrast to Aschenbach, Lolita's experimental masquerade will never reach an old age and transgress itself. He dies as an old man underneath a young man's makeup, who has lost every inch of his much-praised dignity. Lolita deceases as an absorbed and detained child under circumstances that she could not live up to. Prospective motherhood and Humbert's unfitting imprint on her. The quote, brown and leathery skin of the quote, smitten traveler, unquote, will be covered up with a carmine rouge that deceptively suggests life where there is not much left. Whilst his quote, pale and bloodless, unquote, lips quote, swell like raspberries, unquote, the Decadent quote, burnt with fever beneath his makeup, unquote. Aschenbach is not what the makeup insinuates, which again draws a parallel to Lolita and her unattained womanhood. Secondly, Tajou's decadence resembles the dual nature of Venice itself. In mythological terms, the boy's appearance is no coincidence. It has been well chosen by its perpetrator. Knowing Aschenbach's initial consecrated loyalty to everything that is Apollonian, Dionysus exactly understands how he needs to present himself to lure his victim into his realm of unreliably phantasmagorical intoxication. However, Tajou's unearthly beautiful facade has explicit loopholes that debunk his true nature. Throughout the novella, Tajou always enters a room from the side of death, quote, from the left, unquote, and innumerable times he walks, quote, diagonally, unquote, as if he was about to cross Aschenbach's plans. Mann attributes the quote, yielding element that carried Aschenbach, unquote, on a black coffin-like gondola, the engulfing immeasurable, the sea, to the territory of Dionysus. In accordance with this concept, Tajou predominantly wears either a quote, lightweight sailor suit of blue and white striped cotton with a red silk bow on the chest, quote, unquote, or an quote, English tailor suit, unquote, with a quote, dark blue sailor's coat, unquote. Additionally, he wears a sailor's hat, a wide upright collar, and his shoes are made of black patent leather, which indicates death and innocence through the use of color. Throughout the novella, the colors yellow, red, and blue are associated with death and symbolically interconnect Aschenbach's looks, the corporeal appearances of the decadence, and Tajou's attire. The quote, pale and charming psychagogue's quote unquote appearance is often compared to the sea in terms of color or as an element operating on the edge, as Tajou is standing on the quote, pale yellow sand, unquote, and is often referred to as quote, a noble figure there on the edge of the blue, unquote. Aschenbach nevertheless mistakes him for a virtuous and non-threatening child, although he never really equates him to boys his age, but to older mythological men. Tajou's Apollonian features are his quote, honey-colored curls, unquote, and the fact that the quote, skin of his face was white as ivory, unquote. His soft, dusky curls sometimes appear in a darker gold. The skin of his face is often described as having a yellowish glaze and a marble-like yellow that is sun-resistant and suggests an insalubrious fragility. His quote, strangely misty grey eyes, unquote, or quote, extraordinary dawn grey eyes, unquote, again suggest an in-between state, a color on the verge, an amalgamation of black and white, death and innocence. One of the most double-crossing features he has are his jagged and pale teeth, with no luster of health and a peculiar brittle transparency. Aschenbach thinks that he seems to be, quote, very sensitive, sickly, unquote, that he will, quote, probably not live long, unquote, and ponders on the idea whether Tajou could be anemic. On a mythological layer, the facade has cracks and Dionysus only needs an embodiment as long as it takes him to pull Aschenbach into the netherworld. The child mirrors the dubious beauty of Venice, the diseased city, full of the stench of decay that will physically defeat the artist. Thirdly, the outer appearances that can be ascribed to almost all the surrounding decadents in Mann's novella resemble traits that belong to Lyne's Humbert and Lolita as well, which can be seen in the following images. Like the enigmatic stranger Aschenbach encounters near the graveyard in Munich and the grotesque Neapolitan ballad monger, Lolita also has a, quote, milky and freckled, quote unquote, complexion, red hair and a pale snub-nosed face. Her milky upper lip somehow reveals her childishness, but also symbolizes the absence of a caring mother figure that gets perverted by a manly sexual connotation. She's just as whitish as Tajou, which demonstrates a deteriorating health. By having copied behavioral and damaging patterns, she harms her own motherhood and the child she is carrying. She is doing it actively, naively, but not out of passion and love, but out of subconsciously transmitted schemes. Lolita connects love to devastation. The pregnant image of Lolita could be seen as a metaphor of Humbert's love. Lyne symbolically places her hands, one caringly positioned on her pregnant belly, the other detachedly holding a cigarette. Humbert sees what he has done, the result of his love. Aborted from him, how she aged, but not matured. She mentally remained a hurt child, her childlike outer matter is shattered. Humbert shows parallels with the, quote, goatee man behind the desk, unquote, with a, quote, cigarette butt hanging from the corner of his mouth, unquote. Humbert's, quote, yellow bony fingers, unquote, are stained by his tobacco consumption, and he too has a, quote, crane's feet, unquote, handwriting that hints at a Mephistophelian nature.